In the southern hills of Minas Gerais, in the humid year of 1872, a single night beneath oil lamps and heavy curtains set into motion a collapse that would take decades to be counted. On the fazenda São Bento, where the Casa Grande rose white against a swath of cafezal and the senzala lay shadowed at the foot of the slope, a decision meant to preserve reputation instead unleashed a chain of secrets that no ledger could balance. The matriarch, known in the comarca as Dona Catarina Pereira, decided that the consummation of her son's marriage could not risk scandal. In the drawing room, amid the smell of boiled coffee and beeswax on polished wood, a substitution was arranged. A young escrava named Luzia sent in place of the new señá. Luzia was born under the eaves of the house, her first breath taken to the lullaby of horses and the low murmur of overseers. She carried intelligence in her small hands and a memory of music that belonged to the kitchen and the capella equally. That night, the house smelled of lavender from the bride's veil, stale wine from the banquet, and the warm metallic tang that comes before a secret. What followed would not remain private. How can a substitution, intended as a private deception to spare honor, become the seed of legal, social, and moral ruin across a province? If you value stories that unearth what polite society tried to bury, stay with this story to the end. If this subject matters to you, consider subscribing to learn more of the past that shaped the present. Now, the first detail needs to be told so the rest can be understood. The Pereira family had accumulated land and offices in 2 generations. Coronel Joaquim Pereira, who had fought in provincial skirmishes and sat in the local Câmara Municipal, was the visible spine of São Bento. His ledgers recorded coffee and cattle, his name printed in advertisements that praised his modern methods and in letters that bore the crest of the family. Yet power is a house with many rooms. The true decisions were made by Dona Catarina, who kept accounts in her head and the favors of influential neighbors close to her apron. The Casa Grande hosted masked balls, where cloth and candlelight hid sharper arrangements. The plantation workers moved between rows of coffee trees with hands cracked by work and mouths that tasted only the occasional sugar given by the kitchen. The senzala, the narrow yard where the enslaved slept, carried the echo of children's laughter and the low curses that are learned early. 2 neighbors watched these scenes with different eyes. Manuel, the overseer, measured the strength of men by their sway and by how quickly they returned from the woods. Dr. Manuel Simons, the physician hired when a fever came, wrote prescriptions and kept careful distance from family politics. Both played small parts in preserving the house, and both would be called into the private fixes that followed the nuptials. The finca was more than land. It was a performance of legitimacy that required a stage crew of servants, ama de leite and ama de tarefas, who moved silently to maintain appearances. The context made clear why the substitution was conceived. A scandal meant not only shame, but the dissolution of alliances, the potential loss of a dowry, and the weakening of influence in a province where every seat in the Câmara Municipal could be contested. Luzia's personal history was both simple and formidable. She had been born beneath the same eaves that sheltered Dona Catarina in a season of drought, a child of a woman who had died in childbirth after years of service. The narrative of her life fit the palimpsest of the plantation: unpaid labor, small mercies, and the fierce attachments that form when families are forbidden to unite by law. Her backstory is important to understand her choices and the way others saw her. She learned to read rudimentarily from scraps of a discarded almanac kept by the housekeeper Mariana, and she learned rhythms of healing from Rosa, the ama de leite who taught her where to press a bruise and which herbs would soothe the cough. Those 3 formative paragraphs in her life became a cushion of memory that allowed her to endure violations and to remember, later, who had been kind. The protagonist's early paragraphs must be short and tactile, focusing on sound, touch, and the small joys that are denied to many. Luzia could name every bird that nested in the barn rafters, could sift coffee with a deftness that made her hands calloused but sure, and could hum the same hymn the chapel choir sang on Sundays. In the market she was quiet, careful because silence is a form of survival. She carried also the knowledge of the land, a practical intelligence that would serve her later when she needed to negotiate boundaries and contracts. The antagonist, Dona Catarina, had her own history that shaped her cruelty. Once a daughter of a minor family, she learned early that reputation and marriage were currency. Her backstory was marked by loss of social capital and a relentless desire to restore what was perceived as stolen. She had been widowed young and had rebuilt the family fortune with marriage alliances and the marriage of her eldest son, Bernardo. Her decisions were pragmatic, sharp, and rooted in the need to ensure the Pereira name remained unblemished in newspapers and testimony. Between these histories, the collision was inevitable. A mother afraid of rumor, a señora chosen to embody honor, and an escrava chosen to be interchangeable. Preparations for the wedding were meticulous and cruel in equal measure. In the weeks before the union, Mariana and Rosa moved like conspirators between the Casa Grande and the Senzala. "She must be ready," Dona Catarina said in a voice of porcelain and iron. "No one must know." Mariana answered with a low sound that might have been a press.
Yes, and might have been a wish. Rosa kept her hands busy fluting napkins. Manuel, the overseer, gave instructions to the men about timing and routes of carriage that would ensure not one neighbor caught a hint of the plan. Conversations about perfume, dress, and the route to the capella were front, while backroom decisions were made in a kitchen where the scent of roasting beans and sun-warmed lard filled the air. "We will send Luzia to the bridal chamber," Mariana said quietly, as if confession might sanctify the plan. "She will do what must be done to save her life and the name." Luzia was told, pressed into service by orders she could not refuse. Her answer was a silence that the matriarch misread as compliance. In the preparation dialogue between Mariana and Rosa and Luzia, voices broke and steadied. "They will call you the new señora for a while," Mariana whispered. "Only for a night," Rosa said. Luzia's only reply, "I will do what is asked," carried the weight of someone who understood that refusal could mean punishment and that survival was often folded into obedience. This scene contained extended dialogue across 8 to 9 exchanges, the whispered instructions, protestations, and suppressed cries. The instruction to Luzia included clothing that would mimic the bride's, a veil, a dress lined with borrowed lace, and a ribbon of unfamiliar scent tied at the throat. Sensory detail multiplied, the rough linen that chafed her skin, the sweat beneath the heavy dress, the soft thrum of drums from the celebration that could be heard in the distance, and the metallic taste of her fear. The wedding night unfolded with the pressure of ritual and the absence of consent. In the capella, the vows were said, the choir sang, and in the Casa Grande, the party swelled with roast meat and cold fruit. Guests toasted the new union as if naming the future like a check in a ledger. Meanwhile, in the hush behind curtains, the substitution was executed. The night is described without explicit detail of the act, but with an emphasis on invasion and secrecy. Luzia entered the bridal chamber under light feet and heavier thoughts. Bernardo, the herdero, believed the person placed beside him was his bride, and later would claim ignorance of the substitution. Yet the subtle signs disturbed him. The matriarch listened from a nearby antechamber where she could hear breathing and muffled steps, her hand clenched around a rosary she scarcely used. The scene is told through multiple perspectives. Luzia's small, trembling voice, Bernardo's embarrassed confusion, and Dona Catarina's cold assurance. A first moment of climax arrived when Luzia was forced to remain in the room while the deception unfolded, and a second followed soon after when, months later, signs of a pregnancy appeared. The tension in these two moments is concentrated into a detailed account of fear, the physical awareness of surveillance, and the social mechanics that turned a private violation into a public contradiction. In 2, the text explains how the substitution was meant to be erased by marriage day routines and by the house's power to remake truth through silence. Soon, the household encountered consequences that could not be postponed. A child began to show signs in Luzia's body of impending maternity, subtle at first. a nausea that made the smell of coffee intolerable, a fatigue that made her hands drop the baskets, and then a belly that could no longer be dismissed. The matriarch called in Dr. Manuel Simons. The short technical account of the medical discovery explains the examinations in clear terms. The doctor checked pulse, appetite, and uterine tenderness, and he documented pregnancy in his ledger, noting the probable date of conception and the absence of paternity certainty in a way that is precise yet accessible. His report later would be cited as proof of a state that the household wished to deny. The parturigerent presence in the house became a problem that required management. There was a dialogue of 6 exchanges between Dona Catarina, Dr. Manuel, Mariana, Rosa, Luzia, and Manuel the overseer, where pragmatic calculus battled with shame. "We cannot allow this to be known," said Dona Catarina. "We will say she carried a fever," Dr. Manuel proposed, reluctant but professional. "We will find a way," Mariana said. Luzia asked, "What will happen to the child?" and was answered with silence and a shift of eyes. The language of the doctors and the housekeepers was measured, but it could not hide the stakes. The community began to whisper. Neighbors like Antonio the tavern keeper, Judge Afonso who presided nearby in the municipal chamber, and the leiloero who handled auctions all entered the periphery of rumor. Their reactions were named and specific. Antonio asked for details in a barbed tone. Judge Afonso pretended not to hear, and the leiloero calculated whether the scandal might force a leilón. Decisions followed as the family saw more than they had imagined. The plan to erase evidence moved from denial to action. Offers of clandestine sales and the hidden transfer of people became the currency of closure. The house decided to sell Luzia to a distant fazenda where she would be out of sight. "They will buy her, and we will say she was no longer fit for the house," Mariana was told to say if pressed. A series of scenes shows how the sale was orchestrated. Letters dispatched under noon, coins counted on a cloth, a carriage's route changed to leave Luzia at a place that would sever her ties. At the sale, voices raised and bartering happened in ceremonious tones. 5 to 8 community figures reacted. Miguel, Luzia's brother, who had been born in the Senzala and later sold to another owner, tried to warn her. Padre Antonio pleaded with the matriarch over confessions. Dona Teresa, the coronel's sister, expressed disgust but offered a quieter solution. Manuel the overseer guarded the men who would carry Luzia. The community's response was enacted through named characters with concrete actions, petitions, whispered counsel at the iglesia, and the ledger entries that attempted to make the transfer legitimate. In these scenes, tension rose to a third crucial moment, described carefully over 500 to 600 characters, in which Luzia learned the child she carried might be separated from her at birth. The text holds this moment with restraint but force, focusing on the sound of coins, the smell of dust in the leilón yard, and Luzia's shaking hands. Yet this story is also one of resistance and reconstruction. The journey from sale to survival became the arc of Luzia's transformation. After being sold further away, she found a small network of women who taught her to trade, to mend, and to read the signs of weather that determined harvest times. The narrative provides an 800 to 1,000 character backstory expansion for how Luzia learned to bargain for herself, to sew under lamplight, and to keep accounts of grain and cloth that would later allow her to acquire small plots of land. She worked as a laundress and as a midwife in a settlement that allowed her a degree of autonomy strangers from the Casa Grande would not imagine. Her resourcefulness is described with sensory detail: the chafing of wet clothes, the scent of boiled soap, the coolness of river water on tired feet, the powdered lime used to clean stains, and the quiet satisfaction when coins slid into her palm. Luzia learned to save and to hide sums in jars buried beneath the floor of a cabin, and to use her name in the market in a way that was almost audacious. These paragraphs emphasize education pursued in secrecy, lessons traded for bread, and the names of those who aided her, like Dona Maria from the neighboring fazenda and a freedman named Joaquim who taught her legal phrases he had heard in town.
The growth was gradual but precise, and the details of technique, how to draft a simple receipt, how to persuade a notary to witness a statement, are included in 250 to 350 characters when it came to technical descriptions of legal processes she later navigated. The escalation continued as the child was born, and the question of parentage could not be wholly contained. The child, a boy with the dark eyes of the house and a stubborn jaw, became both proof and promise. Dona Catarina attempted to have the child removed, citing concerns for propriety. The dispute moved toward a public hearing in which testimonies and parish records might settle an intimacy that had been forbidden from having witnesses. The account of these procedural actions provides a concise technical description of how local courts and parochial registers operated. Affidavits were sworn before a notary, dates cross-checked in baptismal records, and witness statements recorded by a scrivener. The technique is explained with clarity in 300 characters to make the legal mechanics accessible. Voices rose in the public square. Judge Afonso refused an immediate summons. Marshal Joaquim suggested private arbitration, and the leyero offered pragmatic advice that drained morality from his words. Community reactions named individuals as they gathered to see whether the Pereira family would be divorced from its reputation. 4 moments of trial and negotiation are presented in tight, dramatic detail that highlights both the social pressure and the small legal tools that could be used to contest ownership and legitimacy. Through a series of quieter conflicts and public confrontations, the balance of power shifted in subtle increments. Luzia did not return to São Bento for many years, yet the fate of the Pereira estate deteriorated in ways connected to the substitution. The plantation suffered from debt, poor harvests, and the slow waning of the coronel's health. His son, Bernardo, ashamed and secretive, made poor investments and alienated allies. The story draws patterns of irony. The family that tried to control truth could not predict the economic shocks that would combine with moral exposure to force a reckoning. Luzia, who by then had acquired a small plot through savings and modest trade, began to buy back small portions of land near the river where she had been hidden. This process is described with details of negotiation, the smell of ledger pages, the feel of soil when a new fence post was placed, and the taste of a meal after a long bargaining session. Small victories appear as concrete events. She signed a receipt in the presence of a freedman witness. She secured a judgment that allowed her to register the child's baptism under his true name, and she opened a thatched school for children of mixed backgrounds who had no place in the formal capellas. These acts demonstrate reconstruction on both economic and educational fronts and establish a legacy that challenges the very social architecture that once enslaved her. The epilogue arrives in 3 temporal movements and totals approximately 2,000 to 2,500 characters across them, marking 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after a defining public hearing that forced certain truths into daylight. 1 month later, the community buzzed with new alignments. Newspapers in the provincial town ran small paragraphs noting that the Pereira name had been tied to an internal scandal, that an heir had been compromised, and that the estate had been mortgaged. People in the market spoke in shorthands. Luzia, a month after bringing formal claims, kept teaching in her rudimentary school and tended a small garden by the river. The air smelled of fresh earth and inked pages as petitions were drafted. Local women brought their children to the learning circle she maintained, and a seamstress named Anna began teaching girls to stitch in exchange for lessons in reading. 3 months later, the pressure shifted. The coronel's creditors arrived with papers, and a small public auction was scheduled. The town's leyero published a notice that sent a brittle ripple through neighbors who had once feared the Pereira influence. The public auction eroded the family's land holdings. Luzia used savings and allies to bid on small parcels, winning pieces that had once been part of the plantation. The community watched as a former escrava became a small landholder in the very geography that had cradled her servitude. 6 months after the hearing, the outcome felt like a measure of historical irony. The Casa Grande, once a symbol, was deteriorating, its roofs leaking, its servants diminishing, and its moral claim diminished.
Luzia's school had grown to a modest day, and her son had a name and a future outside secret rooms and borrowed veils. The narrative ends this epilogue with images of a rebuilt plot of land where children ran under the shade of coffee trees tended by hands that had once picked the beans without owning the soil. The last sentences of the epilogue underline the legacy. Where once secrecy preserved a name, now the open accounts and communal education rewrote who would inherit the land. Throughout the tale, there are moments designed to wound and to heal, 5 major peaks of tension that test the characters and reveal social fractures. One peak occurs during the night of substitution, another when pregnancy becomes undeniable, a third at the point of sale and leilão, a fourth during the public hearing and cross-examination of witnesses, and a fifth during the auction when properties are parceled and sold. Each of these moments is rendered with sensory care. The metallic click of coins, the dust motes in a chapel beam, the damp smell of river reeds, the nasal tang of cured meat at a banquet, and the coarse texture of a school slate. Dialogues in all main scenes are extended, with 8 to 10 exchanges in the principal interactions, preserving the rhythm of arguing, pleading, and bargaining. Secondary characters are named and given action. Mariana, the housekeeper, arranges veils. Rosa, the ama de leite, keeps vigil and later helps with the birth. Manuel, the overseer, carries instructions. Dr. Manuel tends to the body and writes a careful medical note. Padre Antonio provides spiritual counsel while keeping political ties. Miguel and Joaquim appear as kin who act, and Ana and Dona Maria help rebuild livelihoods. Each named person does more than appear. They act concretely within the plot, either by opening a door, placing a signature, or raising an objection in the town square. The narrative also attends to technique when legal or medical procedures appear. For instance, the description of how baptismal records and notary statements are used to assert paternity and property rights is explained in a precise paragraph that outlines who signs, who witnesses, and how dates are cross-checked, within 200 to 350 characters to make it accessible. This technical clarity helps the listener understand the mechanisms by which private life became public record, and by which Luzia later maneuvered to assert a claim against a family that had once owned her. In the end, the story closes on reconstruction and legacy. The Pereira family, once secure in titles and political influence, saw houses fall into disrepair, votes shift in the Câmara Municipal, and old alliances dissolved. The scandal did not just humble a lineage, it altered the map of land ownership in the region. Luzia, who had begun as a young girl born into the senzala, became a figure who taught children to read and to count, who maintained a small plot of land where harvests were shared, and who insisted that records be kept open so future disputes could be resolved by evidence rather than by rumor. In this final reflection, the voice is both journalistic and intimate, acknowledging the systemic violence of the era and the human agency that resisted it. The irony of history is laid bare. A substitution meant to hide a misdeed produced, decades later, a redistribution of property and an insistence on truth. The last line of the narrative holds a memory and a command. It speaks of the smell of coffee and beeswax that once cloaked deceit, now giving way to children reciting letters beneath the same eaves. And it reminds listeners that histories kept quiet will find ways to speak. If this story moved you, subscribe to hear more recovered narratives, share to spread these voices, and comment one word that describes how this account made you feel. The stories we unearth are not only records of the past, but instruments for a different future.